now to our last week of our MTMF Easter series. We started with the Apostle John, a guy who continued the mission of discipleship even into his 90s. We then moved on to the Pharisee Nicodemus and saw a guy who showed a lot of signs of being a follower of Jesus. And last week, we looked at a guy who made a big blunder by denying Jesus. He didn't let that define him, and he grew from it. Peter became an incredible disciple of Jesus and led many people to obey God's commands. And to wrap up the series, we're going to look at a guy who also failed Jesus, just like Peter. However, he didn't respond well to his failure. He definitely didn't grow from it. He ended up letting his failure define him. He is the antithesis to Peter. He's none other than the infamous apostle, Judas. Judas was called as one of the 12 apostles of Jesus. Now, there isn't much we know about him before his calling, but we can learn a few things about him based on some context. First off, something interesting about his name is that it literally means praise God. That's not a term you typically think of when you think about a guy who betrayed Jesus. But names were important in that culture, and obviously, his parents had plans for him to be a man who praised God. The other thing we can learn about his name is the surname that's given, Iscariot. See, he's first mentioned as an apostle in Matthew chapter 10, when all 12 apostles, they're sent out by Jesus with the power to drive out impure spirits and to heal people. But starting in verse 2 of chapter 10, we see all their names. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and his brother Andrew. James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. Philip and Bartholomew. Thomas and Matthew the tax collector. James, son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus. Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Now, Iscariot is most likely a reference to his hometown. It's a combination of two words, Ish, which means man, and Kerioth, which is the name of a town that Judas was from and was in the southwest corner of Judea. This is important because it seems as though Judas was the only apostle who wasn't from the region of Galilee. So in a way, he's kind of like an outsider. But we also see his role as an apostle. He was the one who handled the money. Now that's a very unique role for him to have, because there was another apostle in this group who we know for a fact would have been very good with money, and that's the tax collector Matthew. So why did Jesus choose Judas as the one to handle the money? I'm not sure. The Bible doesn't say. Maybe since tax collectors were so despised by the Jews, that Jesus knew that the rest wouldn't trust Matthew. I'm not sure, but one thing we do know is it would imply that Judas was trusted by the group. Now, it was a misplaced trust, as we read about in John chapter 12. See, in this passage, Jesus and his disciples are in Bethany visiting his friends Lazarus, Martha, and Mary. And Mary uses expensive perfume to honor Jesus. And Judas speaks up when Mary does this. Starting in verse 4, it says this. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. So there are two things we can take from this passage. One is that Judas was a thief. And second, he cared about earthly things. See, that's important because it might give us a better understanding of why Judas chooses to betray Jesus. Now, we know from other passages from Luke 22:3 and John 13:27 that Satan entered into him and deceived him to betray Jesus. However, when we consider the fact that many scholars believe that he was a zealot, we see maybe another motive for his betrayal. See, another interpretation of the surname Iscariot comes from the Hebrew word Sicarii. I don't know if that's right or not, but this was a splinter group of the Jewish zealots who strongly opposed Rome. They would literally carry daggers around with them at all times so they could start riots in hopes to bring Rome down. So if this was the mindset of Judas, it makes a lot of sense that he would want to turn Jesus over. He'd spent years with him and saw his power, that he could heal the sick, he could feed everyone, he could even raise people from the dead. So when you consider that many Jews thought that the Messiah was going to be a military leader, and that Judas could have even been an extremist of this, you can maybe see why he tried to maybe force Jesus' hand. Now, it doesn't excuse what he did. In fact, he was still very deceptive in how he betrayed Jesus. It made a big statement that he did it with a kiss. See, he could have betrayed him in a lot of different ways, but he chose to do it with an act that shows respect to that person, which is really a big slap in the face when you think about it. I mean, it's not like the soldiers who were arresting Jesus didn't know what he looked like. He was very famous. Luke 22 gives us Jesus' reaction when Judas comes to betray him. Verse 47 says this: "While he was still speaking, a crowd came up, and the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus asked him, 'Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?'" So Jesus is calling him out here for his betrayal, that he would use such a symbolic and respectful gesture to betray him. But Judas, at this point, shows absolutely no remorse or questioning of why he's doing this. However, something interesting does happen immediately after this in Luke's gospel. See, the very next passage is about what we talked about last week. It's Peter's denial of Jesus, his failure. So Luke is putting side by side here these two disciples who failed miserably when Jesus was arrested. As we saw last week, Peter repented of his sins. Jesus then reinstated him to a place of leadership that he then used to grow the kingdom. He didn't let his failure define him. But here's where we see the difference in their stories. Judas does let his failure define him. Now, we don't know if he repented. Now, there is some reason to believe in the text that he actually did, at least a little bit. Matthew records his initial reaction once Jesus is on trial to be crucified, and when he sees that Jesus isn't fighting back and trying to take down Rome like he might have thought. Let's pick up the reading in Matthew 27 to see his response to his failure. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. "I have sinned," he said, "for I have betrayed innocent blood." "What is that to us?" they replied. "That's your responsibility." So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. So we see that Judas felt sorry for what he did. I like how the translation here says that he was seized with remorse. His sorrow led him to return the money that he was given for the betrayal. Now, we don't know his full motivations for this change of heart about the money, but we do know that he thinks that Jesus was innocent. So he obviously thinks he made a mistake. And it's at this moment that Judas could have redefined his future. He could have gone to Jesus and asked for forgiveness. I mean, we know John was present at the crucifixion. He could have prayed to God asking for forgiveness and committed to living his life as a changed man, leading others to Jesus, discipling them. You can understand why he felt awful for realizing that the awful thing he had done was so bad. But his decision to take his life from this remorse is what made this betrayal define him for the rest of human history. When he made that decision to hang himself, he took away his opportunity to rewrite his story, his future. Judas and Peter could have easily switched places. Peter could be the one whose name elicits a negative response, and Judas could have been the one who was a great leader for the church. That's not what Judas did. He had an opportunity to move the mission forward, even after he made an awful mistake. But he chose to end his life and to not change his future. We all have those moments in our lives where we can just live in our mistakes and let our failures define us, or we can let those mistakes sharpen us, mold us, or grow us into a closer relationship with him, which would then give us a testimony that helps us reach and disciple more people. Judas is a cautionary example of how not to move the mission forward.